Welcome to the Indigenous Voice. This is the first show, and we would like to do a little bit of description about our new show. But before doing anything and saying anything, we would like to, after the first acknowledgement we have another acknowledgement for Jack Atkins and his role in inspiring people to work in community TV. So from our show, Indigenous Voice, we would like to say thanks, Jack. And we know you are now under the weather, and we know your energy will be back soon. Thanks. In this show, we have our first guest is, we have here Beck, Peacock, and he's a screenwriter for a film called Emerald and Grey. Welcome, Beck, to our show.
Thank you.
Thanks. Would you please give us a little bit introduction about your background?
Well, yeah, I taught at the University of San Diego and Palomar College for many, many years, retired. I taught film studies as chairman of the department there. I've also been an author. I wrote a textbook on film called The Art of Movie Making, Script to Screen. I wrote a book on divorce called Learning to Leave, which is different aspect of life, but it was a bestseller in its little niche. And I've written, I've produced and directed a documentary called Petals, Journey into Self-Discovery, which did international film festivals, Vancouver Film Festival, and so on. So I've been involved with film and writing scripts. I've written 2 other scripts besides the one here, and so it's in my life.
And how you come across the residential school story?
Residential school, well, like a lot of people, I guess, in the sense that very little was known in the popular culture until 3 or 4 years ago, when it started coming out in the press regularly, and now it's in the press all of the time. And as I caught up with the whole situation of residential schools in Canada, I was, like a lot of people, shocked, interested, embarrassed that I didn't know more. And the more I thought about it, the more I got involved in it, the more research I started doing into it, I realized that it was a big hole in the Canadian culture, Canadian history. I remember recently hearing Pierre Trudeau say, when they talked about residential schools and the whole situation that happened with the Indigenous people, First Nation people, that he remembers seeing 2 or 3 short paragraphs in a history book that he had when he was going to school. And to me, hearing that, it would be like in the United States, having the subject of slavery or something, you know, being a little footnote in a history book. This is an extremely important part of Canadian history, and it had been ignored, submerged, forgotten. And I feel that it's very important to get that story out. The stories come out certainly in the research being done by the reconciliation committees. But those kinds of works, and I've got the volumes myself, and I've studied them very well, but they don't get read by people. There have been many. There have been several very good documentaries on the subject of the residential history of the residential schools. But like a lot of documentaries, they are a niche kind of, you know, get a niche audience. Sometimes they connect very strongly, but they tell a different story that I'm telling, because I'm attempting to tell a story that's a dramatic narrative, in other words, a feature film, and that tells a very it tells a different story. It tells a story from a different angle.
So what's the nature of the project?
Well, what I've attempted to do, and I think I've achieved it, is tell the story that has to be told in a very personal way, the way a narrative film does. A documentary will tell a story, give you the facts from the outside, the exterior. They'll give you the facts and figures, and it can be very, very powerful. But a narrative drama forces, in a sense, the viewer to live the life of the people in it. You're living subjectively in the world of the participants that you're writing about. In my case, I found it at first difficult to approach as a screenwriter. Difficult because when you get into the story of what happened in residential schools, the stories are dark, grim, and they just get grimmer. They just get darker because as much as you want to explore and express and expose what happened, it is so cruel that for a screenwriter who's doing fiction, a narrative film, you need another angle. You can't start at the bottom and go down. And that's what it felt like when I got into it.
But isn't it like a kind of just a small chapter of a bigger story, the colonial?
This is a small chapter, and I did choose a particular time and place. Actually, right here in British Columbia, 1933. I've set the story in. But even at that, it's like, how do I approach this subject? And what I came up with, I think, was works, in the sense that I've taken parallel stories. I've taken the story of a young First Nation boy who's caught up in the system, who gets caught up in the system, and the system was a very cruel system. As you might know, the system is one in which the powers that be came into villages and took away all of the children who were 5 and 6 and 7 years old and put them in residential schools until they were 17 and 18 years old. Took them out of their families, stripped them of their culture, didn't allow them to use their language, abused them emotionally, sexually, sometimes, for, quote, all the right purposes.
Culturally, of course.
Yeah. So how do you tell that story? What I came up with was telling the story from two angles, telling the story of a gray nun, what they call the gray nuns who ran the school, this particular school at Cooper Island, and tell a story from a young nun's point of view as well as a boy's point of view. So we're getting two sides of this. And it turns out that this nun, who's from Ireland originally, comes to Canada, and she's as much in, I don't want to say quite as much, but she's caught in the system herself. She's a prisoner of her system that she's been brought up in. I know that system well. Look, what happened, stepping back from it a bit, is that back in the 1880s, Canadian government set up residential schools for seemingly all the good purposes, and that is to bring Indigenous people into the main culture and give them the tools that they might need to advance in the post-industrial revolution and so on. After setting up several schools in the 1880s and 90s, the government of Canada decided that they didn't want to do the tough work that it takes. They set up trade schools and so on, but they discovered quickly that if you pass these off to religious schools, religious institutions, the Catholic Church mainly, but also the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the United Church, that they could achieve their goal, supposedly, which much less expensively, much cheaper. And when you study the history of this whole residential school, you continually get the federal government coming in and saying how much less can they spend per student, especially when we get to the point that I'm talking about in 1933 with the Depression, and they basically stripped the schools of so much of their financial backing that schools had to finance their own food, diets, and so on, and they were very meager to start with. Go ahead.
So, sorry, what are the new updates about this history? The new updates about this history you are talking?
Well, could I update it? It went on until the 1960s, 70s, even if you want to get technical about it, in 1990s, there were still some schools, residential schools functioning. But certainly in the, at the turn of the 1900s and throughout the first half of the 20th century, residential schools were rampant throughout Canada, Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. My story takes place in British Columbia.
Is there any estimation for the number of children went to these schools? Overall number, how much during that
How
time?
many? Oh, at times 50,000. I have the figures, you know, from a book, but I can't quite quote exactly the numbers now. But there were huge numbers of First Nation children in the schools. And again, if you look at a documentary like Return to Cooper Island, which was done about 25 years ago, and Peter Campbell is at this moment doing a remake of that documentary. Cooper Island, if you're not familiar with it, is right off Ladysmith, an island off south end of Thetis Island. And the school was very active throughout the 20th century. And it's a very moving documentary that's been made that a group of First Nation graduates go back to Cooper Island and recall, you know, personal histories, personal events, situations that happened to them. I have to say, I actually borrowed a bit from that documentary in my film screenplay because it was so striking and so hard. One of the difficult things in writing the screenplay is that I really had to tone it down. There are so many truly devastating stories that come out of it, you know, recorded, verified, that if I were to choose the worst of them, there would be a tendency for the viewer not to believe it, or to feel like you're just piling it on. So in a sense, from the screenwriter's point of view, my point of view, I had to very selectively choose situations that this boy gets into, or that he's caught up in, when the 6-year-old is taken away from his family and has his head shaved, and gets a number that he goes by, changes his name. None of the names were the same. They're all given Anglo names, and then taken into a system that you're literally stripped of your culture. Let me read just a touch from, and this is from 1880s, John Macdonald, Prime Minister. When a child lives in a reserve, he is surrounded by savages. His habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. I strongly believe that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence. The only way to do that is put them in residential schools where they will acquire habits and modes of thought of white men. I mean, that's from the Prime Minister. And as that is translated, you know, throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, that became the law, in a sense, of the land, or the law that that the First Nation people were under.
What struck me that terms, even the colonial settler used the term white man.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah.
I completely tried to take that the matter of colors outside, it's a matter of sun. More exposed to sun, more darker skin you have, but to put people in category based on white or non-white or color or non-color. So it seemed not just the victimized, colonized people see that the white man, as they say, but also the colonial settler called himself the white man as well. So
you know, in a sense, the big unspoken secret, and it's not a secret at all, is that you know, Canada, the United States are born in racism. You know, it's in the DNA. You know, it is, you know, it's attempted to be suppressed and attempted to be bypassed and attempted to be avoided, but it's there, and it comes out in so many ways. In the 1930s, the period that my story takes place, the schools were attempting to teach the boys farming, right? Modern farm techniques. But it's against the law in 1933 for, as they say, an Indian to drive a mechanized farm vehicle. It's against the law for them to. Now you're teaching kids modern farming, but you say you can't use any of the equipment because it's against the law. I mean, these kinds of incongruities run through the whole system. The screenplay that I take it from two points of view, however. I take it from a nun's point of view, who comes over, 22-year-old nun from Ireland, innocent, and she is buying into the whole thing, which we all were. I was brought up a Catholic. I was in a religious order. I was a Trappist monk for a while. I know the territory of Catholicism and the mythologies. And there was a ingrained belief that you are going to save the pagan, save the heathen, give them, you know, you know, Christ and everything that He has promised. So I'm looking at the point of view from a young nun who arrives here, and she, in her own way, is as much a kind of a prisoner of the system as the boy is. And I have them create a relationship in the film. And I think it's quite a sympathetic one. More sympathy than the church probably deserves.
Vic, we have like around maybe like a minute. What is the status now of the screenplay?
Well, like a lot of screenplays, the status is still to come. I have it out. There is a production company that's shown interest in it. To get a thing done, for something to arrive on the screen is a you know, real process. Sometimes it can happen like that. I mean, you know, very quickly. Sometimes it's years. I think because this story is so much in the news daily, especially in Canada. You know, you can pick up the Globe and Mail any day, and there's an article on, you know, the church is not fulfilling their obligations in terms of money. There's something going on all of the time. So it's a vital kind of subject, and it's one again that documentaries can deal with, but I think a narrative film really needs a wide audience. The story needs a wide audience. It needs the emotional kind of connection that an audience gets to seeing it on the screen, big screen. So hopefully.
Thanks a lot, Beck, for this this information about this important play, and hopefully its status will be very soon as a film and for everybody to see. Again, thanks a lot, and thanks for watching the first segment of Indigenous Voice. Welcome to the second segment of Indigenous Voice. Our guest for this segment is Tyson Strandlund, sorry. And Tyson is the organizer of YCL in Victoria. Would you please, Tyson, tell us a little bit background about yourself?
Certainly. Like you said, I'm the member of the YCL, which is the Young Communist League. And additionally, I'm a member of the Metis community. And yeah.
Okay. Would you explain to us how indigenous struggle and communism can fit together?
Certainly. Well, there's a number of ways, but for starters, it's important to recognize that the indigenous people's struggle is a colonial struggle and is in essence a struggle of property. And I think there's no party more capable to tackle this sort of issue than the Communist Party and of course the Young Communist League. You know, this colonialism isn't just something in the past, it's a foundation on which our entire country is built on, and something that's perpetuated still today. You know, it's very sad for me to hear often people, you know, venting economic frustrations on Indigenous people, and it's something we hear far too often. And I think that's where we really need to see the common enemy, because this sort of scapegoating obscures the real problem, which is capitalism. You know.
So in that case, communism could be organic to the environment it's growing in. It's not necessary. It's a European philosophy, let's say, or European idea, and it's imposed now on the indigenous. You agree with that?
Certainly, certainly.
Okay. Lately, we're in Monsanto rally the other day, and you made a very good speech. Actually, people were very impressed. Would you please tell us a little bit about that rally and your speech?
Well, certainly. Again, speaking to the last point we talked about, Monsanto is something that doesn't just affect indigenous people, rather their genetic modification of crops and their toxic monoculture is something that threatens the food security and the health of the entire planet. I mean, they've created seeds that, you know, can't reproduce after a single planting, so you have to buy more and more, and this is insane, really. Particularly, though, indigenous people have been strongly affected by a lot of Monsanto policies. Across North and Central America, corn, heritage species of corn are disappearing. Species that have been stewarded by indigenous peoples and passed down for thousands of years. Moreover, their agricultural methods push out small farmers who can't compete, many of whom are indigenous and have relied on these ways of life for hundreds of years as well, and to whom many of it is a sacred and traditional way of living.
During the talk, in the speech, you talked a lot about the TPP, and it seemed like this is the latest campaign for your party, and so also, what is the connection? Is there any connection here also? Oh,
absolutely. We could talk the whole show about reasons to oppose the TPP, but particularly it really undermines our sovereignty, our sovereignty, not only of indigenous people but of the Canadian state itself. The deal favors the export of raw resources, particularly from forestry and mining sectors, and not only that, it is completely indiscriminate towards whether they're exploiting from ceded or unceded territories, and just as ruthless to indigenous or non-indigenous people. This is the language of capitalism, only really sees profit. Additionally, this totally removes our ability to provide environmental protection. We can be sued for anything that might inhibit future profits under the TPP. Presently, the Obama administration is being sued for $15 billion, in fact, under NAFTA, which is nothing compared to what we can expect under the TPP. I think, you know, there's no possibility for sovereignty of Indigenous people if the Canadian state doesn't even have sovereignty from multinational corporations.
Okay, and by the way, I'm so glad that you're taking note. That's mean you want to express certain thought, which is very good. Thanks for that. But talking about coming back to the TPP and the sovereignty, and that you mentioned that some corporation could sue the government for lost future profits.
Certainly.
On the top of that, the indigenous issue we have now, the Canadian state also stuck with that dilemma, Seema.
Yes, it certainly makes it far more difficult to solve because we haven't even dealt with reconciliation and justice and acknowledgement of the indigenous issue, and yet we're handing our sovereignty away to these corporations who certainly have no interest in any of our well-being.
And suddenly we have both Canadian state and indigenous people facing
Here we are.
the same enemy. Okay, wow. Anyway, now talking more, just also you ran for MB in the last election. And would you tell us about this experience when you were riding, I think it was Esquimalt, Saanich and Sioux?
That's right, that's right. Certainly it was a little different experience running as a youth and as a communist, and we had some successes and we had some things which we learned from. It was certainly an opportunity to express a lot of very important points that the other candidates frankly weren't interested in talking about, from issues of decolonization and the TPP once again, and additionally we took every opportunity possible to demand an inquiry for justice, the inquiry and justice for Canada's murdered and missing Indigenous women, which I think was very important to get out to people. Unfortunately, however, not everybody was really interested in our message being heard, including the Dogwood Initiative, actually, who physically blocked us, in fact, from getting to a debate at one point. And I find it very interesting as an organization claiming to represent democracy and the environment that they would.
So you weren't allowed to speak on some of the what they call it?
The debate.
Debate between the in spite of people put your name on a ballot.
Absolutely.
Okay, and. So, as a youth, going through all that, and also organizer of the youth and working among students and university, what do you think about the whole youth involvement in the political process and let's say in the decolonization process, the one you believe in?
Right. Well, we certainly need a lot more youth participation, and that was one of the reasons I ran in the election. Is that I hope to inspire young people to take up the struggle, to educate themselves, and to resist. And I say educate themselves with particular emphasis because it's important to recognize the completeness of the struggle that we're facing here. That it's not just an environmental issue or an Indigenous people's issue, but these sorts of oppression reinforce each other mutually under capitalism, and that we can't address just one issue until we take it on as a whole piece. And really that's what being a communist is all about, is seeing the big picture and seeing the interconnectedness.
Okay. And is there any activities, like the university, of course, now it's you're taking off. So what you're focusing now on working?
The Young Communist League, of course, hopes to increase its membership over the summer in preparation for new fall activities. We'll be participating with the local Communist Party club, who has renamed themselves recently to the Lekwungen Club, al-Nahawi, in honor of Indigenous people's struggle. Participating in an educational that they'll be hosting about Marxism and communism.
Okay, coming back to because this is the most important aspect in this show, is bringing the perspective of Indigenous people. What do you involve in any activity around in town related to indigenous community?
Certainly, I'm regularly involved with the Metis community, and I often participate in their recycling drives and things, and to help keep the environment clean. And
by the way, where did you grow up, Tyson? Where are you from? Are you from the island here?
Yes,
okay.
my whole life. Yes, absolutely.
But originally, where are you from?
Well, I was born in Victoria, but my Métis heritage, of course, comes from Manitoba a couple generations back. My grandmother grew up in the sort of Red River area, and I have some family connection to Louis Riel, in fact.
Okay, would you please tell us more about that?
I believe it's my grandmother's great aunt was the sister of Louis Riel. And my middle name is Riel in his honor, obviously, a great Canadian Métis hero to look up to. So.
Okay, could you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, of course, Louis Riel has in the past faced a lot of negative sort of propaganda from Canadian government and history courses, but that's changed in the last couple decades, and increasingly he's seen more as a freedom fighter and as somebody who fought for Indigenous people's rights in Canada in a very oppressive time at that.
Okay, it's just talking about as a communist, you see, of course, the whole indigenous community around the world are as one people facing the same kind of colonization, the same kind of process of exploitation and oppression. So how can the indigenous community who are scattered all around the world, separate, isolated in their own struggle and own dilemma, let's say, can work together or kind of collectively kind of stand up as one? Especially I'm saying that because you're coming from the background of talking about, as a communist, the whole worker or the whole oppressed of the people is supposed to be one. And so what's your take on that?
Well, that's certainly a big question, but I mean, I think the first step is really the recognition that it is one struggle and that it is one common enemy and that we are one common sort of oppressed group at the end of the day. I think education.
You mean facing one enemy, you mean a system?
Yes,
because you can at the same time be the victim or the oppressor, but the difference between that and that is the system which they believe in. And
absolutely.
Okay. Now we had in our first segment here in the show, Beck, Peacock talk about the residential school, and we were talking about the reconciliation process, and we're hearing a lot in the media about. Do you think we can get to real conciliation without first, as we were talking about, acknowledgement first, then the process of justice or compensating? Or because, as you know, until now, after a century of exploitation and colonization, we blame the indigenous people about they are the reason for their own trouble. I mean, and all the stereotypes still so alive in our society. So how can we bring to acknowledge first? How can we start that? Do you have an idea? Does the YCL work on an issue like that?
Well, certainly there's a few things that have to happen. First of all vestiges of colonialism need to be completely removed from the existing legislation. We need to abolish the Senate, and I personally believe that it should be replaced with a House of Peoples representing Canada's Indigenous peoples. We need to recognize all the rights of Canada's Indigenous people, up to and including the right to secession. We need to draft a new constitution and create a Canada that's based on equality and voluntary participation across the nation, and that also includes Quebec.
There was a lately United Nations, Canada did it changed its position after the Harper government on the indigenous issue. Are you aware of that latest move by Trudeau government?
Which move?
It's they reverse their position on the indigenous issue in United Nations.
Yes, the Harper government had, yes.
Yes, and what, could you tell us please a little what damage the Harper government did in that regard to the indigenous community?
Well,
I know we don't have time left to about a little bit.
Certainly, there's a lot of damage that the Harper government did, but in terms of the complete lack of acknowledgement of the rights of Indigenous peoples on an international stage was humiliating and indignifying for all of us, and should be for Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike, because this was it was from another time, and yeah.
Yeah, the problem is, actually, we have kind of a layer on the top of other layer of issue, like from the indigenous, as I call it, the original sin.
That's right.
What happened to the indigenous people, and then you have this population who is stuck in the cycle of capitalism to work. And it's what the story is mainly. It's about, as you said in the beginning, property and resource and dominating of these as on that level only.
Absolutely, the destruction of our environment, the massive capitalist profits, and the trampling over the rights of Indigenous people are all intimately connected. And that's what, if I could give any message today, would be for everybody to recognize.
Actually, we can see what kind of capitalism brought, like, for example, to the Inuit people who lost even their own diet. They are unable to live as they used to, and they even picking up food from the garbage which the corporation is throwing away. Tyson, thank you very much for this interview, and hopefully we'll see you later soon.
Thank you, Mazen.
Thanks, Tyson. Thanks for watching this segment of Indigenous Voice. Welcome to the third segment of Indigenous Voice, and actually would like to mention something we forgot about, which is very important. We would like to thank the volunteer and Shaw to make this show available on community TV. Our guest for this segment is Regina Haasjes, from a member of First Nation. If you please, the Tla-o-qui-aht, is that correct?
I'm from the Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation.
Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation.
Yes, which is from the Tofino area.
From Tofino area.
Yes.
So, Regina, as and our first segment in this show was about the residential school, and you did not go through that, but you went through a similar experience.
Yes, I did.
Would you please tell us about that?
I was during what they called the 60 scoop, and that's where the children's department would come and take your children if they weren't old enough to go to school, into the residential school. They would come and take you, put you in foster home, or adopt you out. And I was in foster care.
And would you explain why that these practices happened?
Well, from way back in the 1800s there, that Sir MacDonald was trying to rid the Indian problem. And when you're not old enough to go to school, what do they do with you? They didn't understand our culture, they didn't understand our traditions, they didn't understand that the importance of family to us and our community. They always said it takes a community to raise a child, and I believe that's true. You know, I'm a mother of two, and I had lots of help raising my children. Even though I wasn't raised with my family. I didn't know my family until I was 2 months away from my 19th birthday. And that's when I started meeting my family.
Okay, and how that started then?
They let me read my file with the Ministry of Children and Family.
Did you ask for that, or how?
Because I was getting close to 19, they let me read my file, and it showed in there that I had another sister, which I did not know about, and a phone number. And by the grace of God, they still had the same phone number.
That sister younger or older?
My younger. I'm the oldest of three from my mother. My mother was 15 when she had me, and 20 when she died, and on her 4th pregnancy.
How your mother died? Do you know?
Epileptic seizure, and drinking.
Okay. And would you please tell us a little bit when you start to first you contact your sister first? Or
My grandfather, yes.
Grandfather,
My late
okay.
granddad, yeah. I called the number, and I was actually so nervous that I even mispronounced my own name, because I always get called Regina and everything else. But I called. I talked with one of my uncles, and then they made arrangements for me to come down from Prince George to Tofino to meet my family.
It seemed like so you were in Prince George all your life until then.
No.
How was
When I was removed from my home, from my grandparents' home, I was taken to Port Alberni and placed with the family there for a year. And then from there, until I was 2. At 2, I went down to Seattle to live with some relatives of mine, my mother's side, for a year, and then I got brought back to Canada. And then I was with the same family the rest of my life.
So your childhood life was moving from place to place, but you have one foster family, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And for me, because I grew up with that family, I'm closer to them. We understand each other. We went through thick and thin with each other. That's why when I went home to meet my family at almost 19 years old, it was hard.
You felt like outsider, as you
Yes. Yes. Don't get me wrong, I love my family. I love both families. And I kind of feel like I'm now out of sorts. Like I don't fit with my biological family, and I don't fit with my foster family. Like I shouldn't be there anymore, but I don't know where I fit with my family. Either side, my mother's or my father's.
And how you came across the art and the drum making and all sort of things?
All those, I learned them by going to a adult First Nations learning center in New Westminster. That's how I was introduced to learning to bead, to make my drum, to explore my creative side. I got in touch with writing poetry, and I'm still trying to really figure out where I really fit. I enjoy doing my beadwork. I enjoy making button blankets for teddy bears, because I love teddy bears. And I just did that once and fell in love with doing it, so I do it all the time. I enjoy doing photography, which I was saying to my niece last night, I think it's quite ironic, because back in the day, First Nations people didn't like their picture being taken because they felt like it was taking a piece of their spirit. And now I totally enjoy taking photos. So.
And what else you do besides drum making?
Besides making drums, I enjoy spending time with my friends. The friends I've met down at the Inner Harbor there, the Causeway. I like reading stories about First Nations people. Understanding culture, traditions. I love spending time with elders.
And why do you think this is important?
Why do I say it's important?
This is important.
It is.
Why?
It is because they are our past to help us keep it going for the future. You know, the past, present, and the future, that's what our elders are. They're passing it on, their knowledge. Like when I do go home to Tofino, I like spending time with one of my elders, because he always opens up and tells me all the stories that he feels is important for me to know at the time. Learning our language, learning how to speak it. It's a big thing because we are losing our language.
Do you do speak your language?
I know some words. I wouldn't be able to have a full conversation with my uncle, but I could have some words. And when I listen to him and his siblings talk, I catch every few words that they're saying. I understand it. I'm doing it modern day style now, as I do it via texting. He'll text the word to me, so I practice it. So I try every time I go see him. I try to use those words.
Do you have kids?
I do. I have 2 grown-up children.
Teach him this language?
I did when they were younger. They're grown up now. My son is kind of interested, but it's not a big thing on his list to do. So,
usually, it's known for all indigenous community around the world that even existence itself, it's a form of resistance, and to preserve these art, that culture, especially language. As you know, language is the storehouse of every culture. It's the way you feel, how you think, the way the whole society is structured. So, and in regard to young generation, are they related to that struggle? Do you think you see young generation want to keep and preserve this form of existence and art and culture? Or
I have seen it with some of my friends' children. I believe that, you know, with every generation that happens. There's always a few that want to just wander off and go experience life. And that's one thing I didn't pressure my children to do, was to stay focused in on, you know, certain things. It's let them learn life, experience life. But if they ever wanted to know more about our culture, they know that they can come to me and they can ask me.
Okay. Is there any organizations or school around on this land here where we kind of teach indigenous language?
My great niece, my niece? No, she's my niece. In my culture, it's different. Because in my language, there's no word for cousin.
Okay.
So instantly, we become brothers and sisters.
Okay.
Like, for example, if your mother and my mother were sisters, your children, you and I would be brother and sister. And then your children would be my niece's and nephew, just as mine would be yours. So my niece went to what they call Journey of the Hearts. And I just thought that was absolutely wonderful.
What is the journey?
Journey of the Hearts is from 2 to 5-year-old get together twice a week, and they learn more about culture, traditions, in an academic learning as well. They help them learn to write, and they go out on field trips, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful, the short time that I was there with my niece. And they show them how to respect the feather. They show them how to respect the button blankets, how to respect elders, because elders are respected in our communities, in our lives, period. And that's why I do have to say, my family did the one that raised me taught me that. Respect your elders. To them, though, the elders was different than how I see elders today. You know, I have the utmost respect for elders in any community, in any culture. They are our history, and they are the ones to help keep that alive by sharing it with us.
Unfortunately, in this, in a big catastrophe like that, there is many tragic element when you have a family really loved the adopted kid, and they teach them, or as you said, they taught you a lot of good value. But in the end, in the overall picture, it's how the system took you away from your indigenous environment, and suddenly you yourself became strange and doesn't, as you said, that is actually at on individual level, as you said, you are not anymore here and not here, and it's kind of an identity struggle now.
Mm-hmm. It is. I always say I can understand the Métis people because they don't fit in what they call the white society, and they're not accepted in the native society, so where do they belong? So I always say I'm on the border, like I'm on the fence. Like I know that I was raised in a non-native home, being told be proud of being native but don't act like one, right? And then meeting my family, trying to get to know my family, I have different morals because of the way I was raised compared to how my family was. You know, I'm the oldest of three that my mother had. There's me, my younger sister, and her and I were brought up in foster care. By the time my youngest sister, my kid sister, was born, my grandparents knew that they have a right to say something, and they managed to keep her and raise her with our family. But yes, unfortunately, she went through the day school, residential school experience. You know, I did a research in the First Nation school I went to. I did a essay on residential school. And when I let my foster sister, it sounds funny saying that, but when I let her read the essay, she said, "Aren't you glad that we saved you from this?" I said, "Saved me from what?" I got the physical abuse, I got the emotional abuse, I got, you know, religion shoved down my throat. And yes, even the sexual abuse happened. And the fact that I had clothes that fit me, and my hair wasn't cut. In fact, it was the opposite. My hair was terrible when I first came. Apparently, I was in rough shape. That's what they said. And my mom, my foster mom, took a long time and lots of care with my hair. So when I got it cut when she was still alive, she cried when she seen me. But
we still have 1 minute, Regina, but I would like to be sure about the future of the kids. Are your kids connected with Tofino, the indigenous community there, and they visit and?
Yes, I forgot to mention that. My father actually is in the hereditary chief's family.
Nice.
And they actually did consider having him take over chiefmanship at 17, which was like, no. But yeah, he does have connections. My daughter, she knows that she can go there. They both know the family, like a small portion of the family.
But good, maybe in the future.
Yes.
Regina, thanks very much for coming on the show, and thanks for watching the last segment of Indigenous Voice.